Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Digging up the tragic fifth wife of King Henry VIII. The reign of the notorious Tudor King, Henry VIII, is remembered for his tragic love life, which resulted in the executions of two of his 6 wives. Anne Boleyn is mostly considered today a victim of her husband, but the most heartbreaking fate suffered by Henry's wives happened to Catherine Howard, his 5th wife. It's believed that when the grotesque and large king married Catherine, she was between 15 and 21 years of age, and the king was 49. Henry was driven by lust in this marriage with the young Catherine, but the whole marriage was short-lived, as on the 13th of February 1542, Catherine Howard made her way to the executioner's scaffold inside the walls of the Tower of London. In one swift stroke from the axe, the executioner took her head clean off. But what happened to her remains after her death is incredibly shocking, and it was not fitting for a woman who did act as the Queen of England for a couple of years. But what is the story of this and the people who searched for Catherine's remains centuries after her death? Catherine Howard married Henry VIII on the 28th of July 1540, and she was a young girl who was incredibly carefree and whose early life had been marked with rumours of promiscuity and scandal. Throughout her marriage to the king, she was involved with the king's favourite male courtier, Thomas Culpeper, who it was said had succeeded the king in the queen's affections. It's believed she may have wanted to marry him earlier, but the pair, by spring 1541, were meeting in secret, and it's believed that these meetings were of a physical manner, and that they were arranged by Jane Boleyn, one of the ladies-in-waiting to Catherine. Rumours at the time swirled around court about this, but also they emerged about her previous behaviour while she lived in the care of Agnes Tilney, the Duchess of Norfolk. It was alleged that she had relations before she became the Queen, meaning that this, in a sense, would invalidate her and Henry's marriage. Thomas Cranmer investigated, and he brought these allegations to the king, and the evidence against her was compelling, including a love letter written to Culpeper from Catherine. Catherine was stripped of her title of Queen on the 23rd of November 1541, and she was imprisoned before she was sentenced to death. Culpeper was executed by beheading, and another man, Francis Derham, who was considered to have had a pre-contract of marriage with the Queen, was hanged, drawn and quartered. Their heads were placed on spikes, and as Catherine was taken to the Tower of London for her execution, the former Queen passed under their heads and screamed. On the evening of the 12th of February 1542, Catherine was informed that she was to be executed the following morning, and was told to prepare for her death. At 9 o'clock the following morning she was to be executed by axe, and she requested that the block should be brought to her, so that she might know how to place herself. The young woman was practising how to lay her head on the block so that the executioner could take the best swing and end her life quickly. On the morning of the 13th of February 1542, in front of a crowd of councillors, lords and ambassadors, Catherine Howard was brought from her chambers to the scaffold that stood on Tower Hill. It was said that she was helped to the scaffold, and it was also said the Queen was so weak that she could hardly speak, but confessed in few words that she had merited 100 deaths for so offending the king, who had so graciously treated her. Another witness said how the Queen had made the most godly and Christian end, and asked all Christian people to take regard unto her worthy and just punishment with death, for her offences against God, and heinously from her youth upward in breaking all of his commandments, and also against the King's royal majesty very dangerously. She confessed on the scaffold, before she quickly kneeled down at the executioner's block as she practised. The executioner, who was armed with his axe, made his final checks before he quickly and swiftly would take off Catherine Howard's head. She was not spared the swordsman execution that Anne Boleyn was, which was considered more reliable and painless, and she died by the commoner's axe, almost as a treasonous criminal would. but she was allowed the private execution inside the Tower of London's walls. Following her death, a number of women, it's assumed former ladies in waiting to Catherine Howard, collected her body, which was then wrapped in a black cloth along with her head, and then took this into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, next to the scaffold. This was where Anne Boleyn had previously been buried, and where many high-profile executed Tudor figures who lost their heads on Tower Hill were buried. These women then, it's believed, placed her remains inside a grave which had been prepared in the chapel, and she then was interred inside of the chapel. However, the story of Catherine Howard's burial is much more tragic and horrific than it's believed. She may have been buried by her ladies. However, it could have also been John Gage, the constable of the Tower, who was in charge of the execution, that collected her remains and then oversaw her burial. Along with his wife, they could have picked these up and taken them into the Tower. Anne Boleyn, during her execution at the Tower, was placed into an oak chest, which housed bow staves, but Catherine Howard's burial had no such coffin. Her remains were wrapped in black velvet cloth, and then there were claims that the people who oversaw the burial then used a rather sparing amount of quicklime that was shovelled over the former Queen's body in her grave. The effects of this would have been that the decay of her remains would have occurred a lot quicker, and that Henry VIII's fifth wife would have literally been dissolved and erased off the face of history, which could have been a sign of the king literally ridding himself of the mistake of Catherine Howard. The women who attended on her would not have had access to this quicklime, meaning that it was more probable that it was the constable of the Tower who tended to this, and it's believed that the king ordered this request to make it seem like she never walked the earth. Quicklime, which was used, had been used for centuries and was placed in plague pits to quicken decomposition, so it was readily available. However, there is some rather compelling evidence that points to Catherine Howard's remains being treated terribly, and it related to the exhumation of remains that occurred at the Tower of London during the reign of Queen Victoria, 300 years after the Tudor period. Visitors to the Tower of London had commented on the state of the chapel and said how it was not fit as a place to house the remains of royals, and it was said by one visitor, "I cannot refrain from expressing my disgust at the barbarous stupidity which has transformed this interesting little church into the likeness of a meeting house in a manufacturing town. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery." But then a proposal in 1876 was submitted, which was accepted, to restore the Tudor chapel to how it once was and make it beautiful again. But in these works the floor of the chapel was broken and uneven, and it needed work, and after removing the flooring it was found that there were a number of royal burials that were here. It had also been used as a place of burial for local parishioners, but there was a petition for the removal of the remains into the crypt, and Queen Victoria sanctioned the removal of the remains of many of the Tower of London's victims, and said the greatest care and reverence should be exercised in this removal, and that a careful record should be kept of every sign of possible identification which might come to light. The workers found the remains of Queen Anne Boleyn, the second wife to Henry VIII, and the Queen's physician came in to inspect the remains, and he concluded that it was her. It was said that at this depth the bones of a female were not found, not lying in the original order, but which had evidently for some reason or other been heaped together in a smaller space. All the bones were examined by Dr. Mowat, who at once pronounced those to be of a female between 25 to 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. But as Queen Anne Boleyn had been found, the search now occurred to find Catherine Howard, and it was believed she was also buried and interred there. There was some debate as to whether the remains of Anne Boleyn were actually Catherine, but Catherine's remains would never be found. this considered shocking and offered up some questions as to what happened to her after her horrific execution. The first theory was that Catherine was so young when she was executed that her bones had not yet consolidated and gone hard, and that they disintegrated quicker than most would. Another idea as to what happened to her remains is that quicklime was used at the time of her burial, and she was literally dissolved upon the orders of King Henry VIII. There were 2 skeletons found in a south-east direction near to the wall of the chancel, and at the time the investigators hoped that one of these belonged to Catherine. One of these was considered much smaller than the other. However, the committee, after analysing the findings, believed that the beheaded remains of the younger skeleton belonged to Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who was executed with Catherine, and the other skeleton belonged to Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who both lost their heads in the Tower. Most Tudor figures were found buried under the floor, but none of these were Catherine Howard. The only bones that possibly belonged to her were found close to Margaret Pole's remains. It was said that these were a collection of bones that had been eroded by lime, and these were linked to Catherine Howard. But the story of Henry VIII's fifth wife is a very tragic and sad one. As a young girl, as young as 16, went to her death inside the walls of the Tower of London. Her story is one which has helped the Tower of London to become infamous as a place of execution and horror, but still today parts of her body may remain undiscovered inside the walls of Tudor's most feared prison. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.